Let's go ahead and get started. Welcome everyone to this Morpheus Tech Brief on Ansible and Morpheus. My name is Martez Reed, Director of Technical Marketing with Morpheus Data. And what we'll actually walk through today is the Morpheus integration with Ansible. And in a tech brief, we're gonna be very technical, as one could imagine. And we're actually just gonna delve into a lot of the integration and the setup and how it works. There'll be a few slides where we walk through how the integration works, but mainly focused on actually demonstrating the technology and the capability of integrating Ansible and Morpheus. So let's jump right into it. We'll start off with understanding what the Morpheus platform is. Primarily focused on enabling self-service cloud consumption. We support over 20 plus clouds. So things like AWS, Azure, GCP, on-prem for things like vSphere, Nutanix, OpenStack, really being able to provide a centralized platform for consumption of cloud. I usually talk about three key components or three key aspects of the platform that we focus on. Workload lifecycle management, which is the ability to be able to provision workloads, VMs, instances in a self-service manner. That includes the automated configuration and installation of software, integration with things like Ansible, CMDB, networking integration with IPAM, DNS, to be able to provide a self-service experience for teams in your organization that are looking to consume application stacks of virtual machines in a self-service fashion to get from the 20 or 30-day life cycle from request to being able to get a fully provisioned workload to potentially minutes. Automation orchestration capability within the platform is one of the things that makes it unique, in my opinion, is being able to integrate with best of breed tools and capabilities to integrate with the workload lifecycle management, but being able to actually execute those in a on-demand or in a scheduled fashion. So being able to run Ansible playbooks on demand, being able to run them on a schedule. And then finally, costing and analytics, being able to understand both from an inventory perspective, what you have across clouds, but also being able to understand the cost associated with that. And then looking at being able to right size those for cost savings. Consumption of the platform includes ITSM integration, specifically ServiceNow, being able to consume Morpheus catalog items via ServiceNow, API, CLI. You have a full-fledged user interface, as well as a service catalog, which provides great self-service capability. So where I can go into the Morpheus platform and simply request a catalog item and specify one or two fields and then be able to get what it is that was requested. So now that we understand what the Morpheus platform is and the advantages and the benefits of it, let's dive into, well, sorry about that. There's the platform security piece as well for auditing, logging, role-based access control, multi-tenancy, SSO, things that are expected in an enterprise environment. So now let's jump into the Morpheus and Ansible integration to walk through that. So let's understand what the integration actually is. So being able to trigger the execution of Ansible playbooks in a self-service fashion. So this can be tied to the spinning up of a virtual machine or an instance that installs something like an Apache or MongoDB, configures the system in the manner that's desired. There's support for defining roles, groups, group variables, as well as host variables as part of the integration. And we'll actually walk through configuration of it. Ansible Galaxy support for installing roles via Ansible Galaxy. One of the things that is really interesting is the secure command bus execution. So being able to execute Ansible playbooks without the need for SSH or WinRM as part of the integration. And then, as I mentioned, a handful of common use case integrations. So provisioning workflow automation, as I mentioned, tying the Ansible playbook execution to provisioning lifecycle for standing up a virtual machine or an instance and being able to run Ansible as part of that execution. Day two, workload automation. So after a VM or an instance has been provisioned, being able to run an Ansible playbook against it to do something like create a file, query the system for information, or perform a backup or an upgrade of a particular piece of software. And then finally, operational workflows is the ability to execute Ansible playbooks outside of the context or the construct necessarily of a resource provision via Morpheus. So potentially something like being able to create a network VLAN on a network appliance or a network box or a switch to be able to provide that in a self-service fashion as part of the Morpheus platform. So now that we understand a handful of the use cases, as well as understanding how the integration works at a very high level, which we'll walk through in more detail, um, here we walk through an example of how the self-service provisioning would work for tying Ansible into Morpheus provisioning workflows, which are what are leveraged for end-to-end automation of a virtual machine or an instance being provisioned. And so in this example, we have a developer. They request a workload. Let's say it's a MongoDB instance from Morpheus. And then what happens is Morpheus, as an example, might talk to AWS to provision the EC2 instance. And so now the EC2 instance is up, it's ready to go to be automated against. So now we want to do things like install packages or configure the system settings, and then we use Ansible to do that. So one of the key things of the integration is the ability to specify or hook into a source control system, in this example, GitLab, for storing your Ansible code and your Ansible playbooks in a version controlled manner, but allowing Morpheus to be able to integrate to pull down that code to execute the playbooks as part of the automation. So Morpheus pulls down the code from GitLab in this case, and then it triggers the execution of Ansible. And then the Ansible playbook is executed against the EC2 instance. Ansible is installed on the Morpheus nodes as part of the initial configuration of the integration. And so Morpheus node reaches out to the source control, and then once it pulls it down, it then runs Ansible playbook command to execute Ansible against that EC2 instance. The capability that's provided is being able to dynamically inventory that EC2 instance. For those that know a little bit more about Ansible, being able to seamlessly target that EC2 instance that was just provisioned via Morpheus without having to statically create an inventory file and specify credentials and things like that. So it's one of the big benefits and ease, in terms of ease of use, to basically out of the box just be able to start leveraging Ansible playbooks for end-to-end automation. So the next example is that day two operation. So being able to walk through developer requesting something, and then now we have the EC2 instance up and it's ready to go. So now we want to similarly pull that playbook from GitLab in our case, and then execute the Ansible playbook against that EC2 instance. This could be something like creating a file or updating or rolling the logs or cleaning up logs, whatever it might be as part of an execution. And then so the last example could be something along the lines of an operational workflow. So operational workflows in Morpheus nomenclature are the idea of being able to execute automation in a self-service fashion out of band of tied to a resource. So in this example, I might have a REST API endpoint that I either potentially want to update, I want to manipulate, I want to do something with that REST API endpoint. And I want to use Ansible to interface with the REST API endpoint. So in this case, we have the developer. They request the item from the Morpheus platform. Once again, pulling the code from our source control, and then Ansible executes against the REST API. And so now that we've walked through some of the common use cases, understood how Ansible, the integration works at a high level, now let's actually walk through what the process is to get started with using Morpheus and Ansible. So here we have a number of steps. So the first step is to install Ansible on the Morpheus node. So let's jump over to the command line where I've got a fresh installation of Morpheus ready to go. And so in our documentation in the Ansible section, there are a number of commands to run. In this case, I'm running a CentOS or a CentOS box. And so what I'll do is I'll install the EPEL release. So yum install EPEL release. So the Ansible package is in a additional repository. And so in this case, I'm adding that additional repository to give my system access to where the Ansible package lives. All right, now what we'll do is we'll install Ansible using yum-y install Ansible. What's going to happen is it's going to install the Ansible package. All right, and once the Ansible package is finished installing, we'll run the Ansible -- version command to verify that the Ansible package was installed successfully. All right, it is now completed, so we'll run that Ansible version command. All right, so now that we know that Ansible has been successfully installed, what we'll do is we'll then go into the Morpheus UI. So install Ansible on the Morpheus node, check. Now what we want to do is add the Ssh Keypair for the Git service account in Morpheus UI. So one of the things we talked about was being able to pull Ansible code from our source control system as part of the automation. So one of the things that we'll do is we'll add an Ssh Keypair. This step assumes that the Ssh Keypair has been created already, as well as added to the user account in the source control system. In this case, I've done both of those already. And so what I'll need to do is we'll go into the Morpheus UI. And then what we'll do is actually go to infrastructure, keys inserts, and we'll add the key pair. So what we're doing is adding the Ssh key pair used for authentication to our source control system into the Morpheus platform. And so my example, it's Morpheus Git. And so the public key will be the public key pair from the SSH. And so I actually have those on the system for demonstration purposes. So in this case, it's id_rsa.pub. So I'll grab that public key pair, public key of the key pair. Go back to my Morpheus UI. And then now I want to get the private key. And mind you, this should be in your environment sensitive information. In this case, it's a demo environment that'll be torn down after this demo is complete. But now that we have the public key, the private key, you can also specify a passphrase associated with the private key if one has been defined during the creation of the Ssh key pair. All right, so I'll save my settings. And so now what that's done is enabled us to have a means of authentication to the source control where our code is stored. So now that we've got the Ansible has been installed, we've added the Ssh key pair. Now what we want to do is configure the Ansible integration in the Morpheus UI. And so we'll come to administration, we'll come to integrations. And what we'll do is new integration, and then we'll go to Ansible. So in this particular case, it's tying this given integration to where my code is. And so I may have multiple repositories that hold Ansible code that I run in my organization. So in this case, I would be tying a given integration to a repository, or I may have subcomponents in that repository that I just simply want to specify as part of the automation. So in this case, I'll name it Ansible demo, and I need my URL. Actually have it in a separate instance already configured. Well, I'll go to integrations, and I will get the URL. So in this case, it is in my GitLab repository. So Git, and in this case, it's GRT manage. And then the organization, in the case of the GitLab, is GRT. And then Ansible demo is what I want. So default branch, I can either specify master or main. In this case, it's still master. A lot of platforms such as GitHub have moved away from master to main as a default when creating new repositories. Playbook paths is the root, and /roles in the repository are where my roles are. Haven't specified any group variables, any host variables. In this case, I'm not using Ansible Galaxy. All my code is local. I can enable verbose logging to get additional information during the execution of the Ansible playbook. Use Morpheus agent command bus is what I talked about, where I can execute Ansible playbooks against the instance without the need to open up SSH or WinRM. What happens is it actually executes via the Morpheus agent in bidirectional outbound manners from the agent. So there's no inbound connection the agent initiates the outbound connection and establishes a channel to allow the execution of Ansible across that channel. So we've got the integration name, we've got where the code lives, and we've got the default branch as well as the playbooks and the playbook in the role path. So what we'll do now is we'll utilize that SSH key pair that we added into our Morpheus platform previously, and then we'll click save. All right, and so looks like everything works successfully. We got a green check mark indicating that the status is okay in terms of the connection. If we click on the name of the integration, we should see a number of plays that Morpheus was able to discover within our repository, and then a number of roles that it was also able to discover as part of that process. And so one of the things we'll do now is we'll jump back and see where we're at in terms of steps. So now we want to leverage the Ansible playbook that we just provided that integration for. So there's an Ansible playbook in our repository that we now want to use as part of a provisioning process. So how do we start to use that? So what we have to do is create a Morpheus task for the desired playbook. So what we want to do in this case, we have a handful of plays. What we want to do is we want to leverage this DB playbook to install MongoDB during the provisioning of an instance. So what we'll do is we'll come into the provisioning and automation section. What we'll do here is we'll create a task, and we'll name it MongoDB install. We'll give it a code, and the type we'll specify as Ansible playbook. We've got our repo there. We want to specify master DB. So no file extension. In this case, it's just the playbook. And then one of the things we'll do is we'll add a -B for become, or in this case, provide elevated privileges during the execution of the automation. And so now we've got a task created as part of our automation. So we'll save that task. We'll go to the next step. What we now need to do is create a Morpheus workflow for the Ansible playbook task. What we did was created the task for automation purposes. And now what we want to do is create a Morpheus workflow that we can tie to a given instance during the provisioning process. What workflows allow us to do is tie task, orchestrate task to things like resources, in this case, a virtual machine, as well as be able to leverage them for operational purposes. So we'll go into the Morpheus UI and create a workflow that we then add our Ansible playbook task to that workflow. So let's create a workflow. Provisioning workflow is what we'll select. So we'll call it Ansible provisioning. And what we'll do is during the provisioning section, we will specify the workflow that we created. So it was MongoDB install. And then we'll click save. So the section we chose was provision. There are a number of stages or phases that we could tie automation to. In this case, we want it to take place during the provisioning phase. So we have our task, and now we have our workflow. So what we want to do now is we want to tie the workflow to a given instance that we provision. So what I've done is pre-created a custom instance in the Morpheus platform for us to use, so we don't have to walk through all the steps of creating the custom instance. So what we have now is the instance type is Ansible MongoDB. And so what I'll do is tie to the layout. I want to click edit, and I want to select the workflow that we just created. So Ansible provisioning is what I want to select. And so click save. And one of the things that was here is I created let me jump back, a custom option type to specify the MongoDB version. So one of the things that Morpheus does provide the capability is to pass variables through to the Ansible playbook execution. So I could specify, in this case, a MongoDB version as part of the execution. So what I'll do is I'll go to my instances. So now I want to provision the instance that I just created. select Ansible Mongo DB. I'll give the instance a name. Select an environment. Select the resource pool. I'll change the volume, size, network. And so what we saw was the version that we added via custom option type is here. So right now it's on 4.2, 3.6, and 4.4 options as well. So I'll click next. So we see workflow here, automation, where we could tie another workflow to it. You're not going to tie a workflow in this case because we've tied the workflow for the Ansible provisioning to the instance already. So there's no need to specify it here. We'll click next and we'll click complete. And so that'll go off and start provisioning as part of the process. And it'll get to a point where it then looks to run Ansible automation as part of the process. So one of the things that we'll do here is we'll actually jump into day 2 operations to see how that looks and how that feels, because we've got an existing instance that's stood up while we wait for the end-to-end provisioning instance to be completed. So similar to the existing automation. So what we want to do is run a different playbook for our day 2 automation. And so we've already got the repository integrated. So let's jump back to our integrations and see that we have a number of playbooks here. So I've got a day 2 playbook that I want to run and be able to provide as a day 2 operation. So similar to the database or DB playbook, we can come to provisioning, automation, and then I could specify another task. So in this case, I'll call it Ansible day 2. I'll give it a code. Ansible playbook, what I want to select. It's already in it's the same, the Ansible integration is where I want it. Hit ref. And so in this case, instead of DB, I want day 2 to be specified. I'll add that same -B flag. Then I'll click save. And so what I can do now is I could tie it to a workflow if I wanted some additional complexity or additional capability as part of the automation. But in this case, I'll just leave it as a task. And I can run a task or a workflow against a instance that's already been provisioned as a day 2 operation. So I'll come back to my instances. I'll select the instance that was already provisioned. And I'll click on actions. And I'll come down to run task. And I see either specifying the MongoDB install. If I specified the MongoDB install, it would give me an error when I tried to execute it because it's intended for phase-based operations. And so in this case, I'll execute the task. And then as part of the automation, what that's actually doing is it's just creating a simple file on the file system. So we can come down here to history and we'll see the playbook starting to execute and it's running now. And so once it's finished, we'll see the output of the Ansible playbook executed against the system. All right, we'll expand it. And so what we saw was the Ansible playbook executed against the system. It ran the task of Ansible create file with content. So that was the day 2 operation that we saw of being able to execute Ansible playbooks against the system. And so if we come to the Morpheus platform, we can see some of the execution in the log format. If we want to, if there's potentially something that's going on or some challenge or issue that we saw. So we see some of that execution taking place on the back end. So we can see things like the Ansible command execution, different components along that regard. And so being able to view those in the log file gives additional insight if there happen to be an issue with the execution that we're not seeing the more verbose output in the UI. And so let's check on our instance to see if it is finished provisioning. So it's still executing. So it says it's finalizing now. So if we scroll down, we can see the Ansible playbook is actually running. So it's performing things like the creation of the MongoDB repository, installing the MongoDB packages, and we saw that it actually failed. So it failed on a task. The inclusion of the MongoDB password is what it was expecting. So we didn't specify that as part of the custom option type. But what this does allow us to see is it was going through looking to execute the Ansible playbook as part of the automation. So what we can do is we would specify the custom option type. But this does allow us to see that the playbook attempted to execute, but also gives us visibility into when the Ansible playbook executes against the system. We can see what's actually happening in real time to see that, okay, I attempted to provision an instance, a provision a workload, and I saw that there was a failure. I now am able to get that granular information about what the Ansible playbook was attempting to do, as well as why it errored out, all within the Morpheus UI. All right, so we walked through the provisioning of an instance. In this particular case, it did fail, but that does give us visibility to see what, number one, we can see from a troubleshooting perspective when the Ansible playbook fails, but then also be able to see that, yes, it did tie that automation to the Morpheus instance that was provisioning. And so as we wrap things up, Morpheus has a community edition that can be used to tinker around and play with the Ansible integration, see how it works, and really just get your hands dirty using the platform. And the other thing I would suggest is if you're looking to get additional information about the Morpheus platform and have one of our sales engineers walk you through a demonstration, you can just go to our website, morpheusdata.com/demo, and fill out a form, and one of our sales engineers will be in contact to get you additional information about Morpheus and potentially Morpheus and Ansible. Thank you for joining this tech brief, and hopefully it was helpful and insightful.